By the time my daughter-in-law realized what I had done, she was standing in the driveway of a house that no longer belonged to any of us, and the only thing waiting for her was a certified letter from my attorney and a locksmith changing the code she thought she knew. I want to tell you how that moment happened. But to understand it, you have to understand what I heard on the night of my 63rd birthday. My name is Harold. I spent 31 years as a licensed civil engineer in the state of Ohio. I built things, bridges, drainage systems, municipal water lines, work that required patience, precision, and the ability to read a situation from every angle before you committed a single line to paper. My wife, Agnes, used to say I was the only man she knew who could look at a blank field and already see the problem that hadn't happened yet. Agnes passed 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer. 11 months from diagnosis to the end. I held her hand every day of those 11 months, and when she was gone, I sat in our house in Columbus for about 6 weeks and did almost nothing except feed the dog and stare at the ceiling and wonder what the second half of my life was supposed to look like without her in it. My son, Brendan, called me every few days during that time. He was living in Charlotte, North Carolina, with his wife Suzanne and their 2 kids, my grandchildren, Owen and Lily, who were 8 and 5 at the time. He was patient with me. He checked in. He said the right things. I appreciated that about him more than I ever told him, and I regret that now. About 8 months after Agnes died, Brendan called with a proposal. Their house in Charlotte had an in-law suite attached to the garage. It was fully finished. Its own entrance, its own bathroom, small kitchen, sitting area. He said Suzanne thought it made sense for me to sell the Columbus house and move down. The grandkids would grow up with their grandfather nearby. I wouldn't be rattling around a 4-bedroom house alone. They had the space. I said I needed to think about it. I thought about it for 3 weeks. I walked every room of the Columbus house. I sat on the back porch where Agnes and I used to drink coffee on Sunday mornings. I opened her closet, which I still hadn't touched, and stood there for a long time. Then I called Brendan back and said yes. The sale of the Columbus house cleared $412,000 after fees. I put $300 of that into a brokerage account I'd held since my early 40s. The rest I kept liquid. I moved into the in-law suite in Charlotte in the spring, and for the first several months, things were genuinely good. I had dinner with the family 3 or 4 nights a week. I drove the kids to school sometimes. Brendan and I watched football on Sunday afternoons. Suzanne and I were polite to each other, friendly even. She had decorated the suite nicely. She asked for my opinion on things. I felt useful. The shift was gradual. That's the thing about these situations. They don't announce themselves. There's no single moment you can point to and say, that's when it changed. It's more like the temperature dropping 1 degree at a time until you look up one day and realize you're cold. By the 2nd year, I noticed I was being invited to fewer family dinners. Not none, just fewer. When I knocked on the main house door, there was sometimes a pause before anyone answered, or Brendan would come to the door already slightly apologetic in a way he couldn't quite explain. Suzanne had started referring to the suite as the apartment. Not Harold's place or your dad's space. The apartment. The kids still came to see me. Owen liked to sit at my little table and draw while I read. Lily wanted me to teach her card games. That part stayed good. Children don't perform warmth. They either have it or they don't, and my grandchildren genuinely wanted to spend time with me. I held on to that. By the 3rd year, Brendan started mentioning money in ways that felt indirect. The property tax had gone up. The HVAC for the suite needed work. He wasn't asking me for anything directly, just noting things the way you'd note them to a landlord. I offered to contribute to the HVAC repair. He said no, don't worry about it, and then seemed almost annoyed that I'd offered. I'm an engineer. I read structures. I know when something is load-bearing and when something is cosmetic. What was happening in that house was structural, and I didn't fully want to admit it to myself yet. My 63rd birthday fell on a Thursday in October. Brendan and Suzanne took me to dinner at a nice restaurant downtown. The grandkids made me cards. Owen had drawn a picture of the 2 of us fishing, which we had done exactly once at a lake outside the city, and the detail he'd put into it. The specific bend of the rod, the color of my vest, meant he'd been thinking about it for a while. I kept that card in my refrigerator for months. We got home around 9:30. I said goodnight and went to the suite. I realized I'd left my jacket in the main house. I'd taken it off in the front hallway when we came in. I waited maybe 20 minutes, then went back across the side porch to retrieve it. The light in the kitchen was still on. The door between the porch and the kitchen was one of those doors with a narrow glass panel, and I could see through it before I knocked. Brendan and Suzanne were at the kitchen island. Their backs were mostly to me. They were talking in low voices, the kind of low that has nothing to do with the children being asleep and everything to do with the content of the conversation. I should have knocked. I know that, but something made me stop. An engineer's instinct, maybe, that sense that you are about to discover a load-bearing problem you didn't know was there. I heard Suzanne's voice first. She was saying something about the market. The Charlotte real estate market, specifically, how it had gone up significantly in the past 3 years. Brendan said something I couldn't catch. Then Suzanne said, clearly enough that I could hear each word, assisted living in this area runs about $4,000 a month. We could pay for 2 years on just the appreciation alone. That's more than fair, Brendan. I stood very still on the side porch. Brendan said something about waiting until after the holidays. Suzanne said she'd already looked at 3 places. She mentioned one by name, a facility on Park Road. She said it had good reviews. She said I would adjust. I picked up my jacket from the hook in the hallway, walked back to the suite, closed the door behind me, and sat down in the chair by the window. The street outside was quiet. A neighbor 2 houses down was still putting Halloween decorations on their porch. I watched them work for a while. A plastic skeleton. A fake spider web. I sat there until after midnight, not moving very much, just letting the information settle into the places in my mind where it needed to go. I was not hysterical. I was not even particularly surprised, if I'm honest. Not the way I might have been if I hadn't felt the temperature dropping for the past year. What I felt was something quieter and colder than surprise. I thought about Agnes. She had always said I was the person who could see the problem before it happened. She was right. The problem had already happened. What remained was the engineering. The next morning, I called my attorney. His name is Robert Tanner. He's been my attorney for 20 years, handled everything from contract reviews on the engineering side to Agnes's estate. He's the kind of man who listens without interrupting and asks exactly one question before he starts talking. When I told him what I'd heard, he asked, Harold, whose name is the property in? I said Brendan's. There was a brief silence. Then he said, Okay, tell me everything. I told him about the sale of the Columbus house, the move to Charlotte, the in-law suite, the 3 years, the conversation on the side porch. I told him about the $300,000 in the brokerage account and the $100,000+ still liquid. I told him I was 63 years old, in good health, fully employed as an independent contractor doing project reviews, and had no intention of going anywhere. Robert said, You're in a legally vulnerable position regarding the suite, but you're not without options. The question is, what outcome you want. I told him I wanted to be the one who decided what happened next. Not Suzanne. Not a facility on Park Road. Me, he said. Then let's start immediately. What followed over the next 4 months was the most methodical work I had done since the last major infrastructure project of my career. Robert and I met twice a month, sometimes more. I consulted with a financial advisor named Phyllis Hartman, who had managed accounts for people in exactly my situation before. Older adults who had made significant transfers of assets within family contexts and needed to understand their position clearly. The core issue was simple. I had sold my home and moved into a space that belonged to my son. I had no lease, no formal arrangement, no documentation of any financial contribution. In the eyes of the law, I was a house guest. Everything Suzanne had said on the side porch was, technically, within their rights to do. But I had $300,000 in investments, another $100,000 in cash, and 31 years of professional experience that included, among other things, a detailed understanding of property law as it applied to construction contracts. I knew how to read documents, I knew how to be methodical, and I had 4 months before the holidays, which was apparently the timeline Suzanne had in mind. The first thing I did was find my own property. I wasn't looking to move to a condo or an apartment. I was looking for something specific. A smaller single-family home, ideally one story, in a neighborhood close enough to Charlotte that I could still see the grandchildren. But that was entirely mine. I looked for 6 weeks. I found a house in Mooresville, 26 miles north of Charlotte, on a quiet street near Lake Norman. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a covered back porch, a 2-car garage. It had been on the market for 40 days and the sellers were motivated. I made an offer. The offer was cash. There's something remarkable about a cash offer on a house. It removes almost all of the uncertainty from the process. No financing contingencies. No bank appraisals holding things up. No 30-day wait while underwriters review someone's pay stubs. I made the offer on a Tuesday. The sellers accepted on Wednesday. The closing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. I told no one in Brenton's household. This is the part I've had to explain to people, and I understand why it looks a certain way from the outside. Why the secrecy? Why not simply have a conversation? Why not tell Brendan what I'd heard and give him a chance to respond? I've asked myself those questions. Here is the honest answer. I had lived in that house for 3 years. I had watched the temperature drop 1 degree at a time. I had been present for dozens of small moments that, individually, meant nothing, but collectively told a very clear story. And then I had stood on that porch and heard Suzanne describe, in specific financial terms, the plan she had for my life. She had already toured facilities. She had calculated the cost. She had a timeline. If I walked into that kitchen and said, "I heard what you said," one of 2 things would happen. Either Brendan would apologize and promise things would change, and then they wouldn't. Because the person driving the plan was Suzanne, and she wasn't going to change her mind because I felt hurt, or they would accelerate the timeline. Pack my things while I was out. Present me with paperwork. Make it fast and done before I had any recourse. An engineer does not pour a foundation on unstable ground. You stabilize the ground first. I kept my routines completely unchanged during those 4 months. I had dinner with the family on Sundays. I drove Lily to dance on Tuesday afternoons. I sat with Owen while he did homework on Wednesday evenings. I was present, pleasant, and entirely ordinary. Suzanne had no reason to look at me and see anything other than exactly what she expected to see. A 63-year-old man who was settled and slightly oblivious and not going anywhere. Meanwhile, I was going somewhere quite specific. The closing on the Mooresville house happened on a Thursday morning in mid-February. Robert drove me. I signed the papers at a conference table in a real estate office 15 miles from Brendan's house. The deed transferred into my name. I received the keys. I sat in the parking lot afterward for about 10 minutes and called Agnes's sister Rosemary in Cincinnati, who was the only person outside of Robert and Phyllis who knew any of this was happening. Rosemary cried a little. I told her I was fine. She said Agnes would have laughed until she cried. I think that's true. The Mooresville house needed a few weeks of work before it was properly livable. Some painting, a deep clean, a few appliances I needed to order. I arranged all of this while continuing to live in the suite. Contractors went to the Mooresville house while I was at Brendan's. Everything moved forward on a parallel track that no one in that household knew existed. In the 3rd week of February, I made an appointment with Robert, and we drafted a letter. It was formal and courteous and extremely precise. It stated that I had acquired a residence and would be vacating the in-law suite on March 8th. It noted that I wished to maintain a relationship with my son and grandchildren and hoped we could arrange regular visits. It was 3 paragraphs long. Robert mailed a copy to the house and sent a copy by email. I left the copies where they would be found. Then I went to the Mooresville house and I did not go back. I heard from Brendan that same evening. He called at 7:15. I let it ring twice, then answered. He said, "Dad, what is this? What's happening?" I said, "I bought a house, Brendan. I'm moving there March 8th. I'd like to still see the kids on a regular schedule if you're open to that." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Did you hear something? Is this because of something you heard? I said. I heard enough to understand that I needed to make my own plans. I'm not angry with you. I'd like to talk about a schedule for Owen and Lily. He said Suzanne was upset. I told him I understood. He said she wanted to talk to me. I told him I didn't think that would be productive, and that if there were practical matters to discuss about the suite or my belongings, he could handle them directly with me. Then I said goodnight, and I ended the call. I sat on the back porch of the Mooresville house that evening. It was too cold to be outside, really, but I wanted to be outside. There was a light on in the house across the street. Someone walking a dog. The lake was about 4 blocks away, and I could smell the water faintly, the way lakes smell in winter, flat and clean. I had a glass of bourbon. The good kind. The kind I kept for occasions that mattered. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened after. I did not take any action against Brendan or Suzanne. I did not pursue legal remedies. I did not attempt to reclaim anything or make any formal accusations. What I did was entirely and solely about myself. About making sure that the next chapter of my life was one I had authored, not one that had been written for me while I sat in a chair and waited. The legal situation, as Robert had explained it, gave me less ground than I would have liked. I had no formal claim on the suite. I had contributed no documented funds to the household. If Suzanne had moved against me, my options were limited and expensive. By moving first, I moved onto ground that was entirely solid. Solid ground is everything. In the weeks after I moved to Mooresville, Brendan called several times. Our conversations were careful, not cold, exactly, but careful. He asked questions I answered directly. He said Suzanne hadn't realized I'd been as unhappy as I apparently was. I didn't argue the point. I told him I wasn't unhappy anymore. He asked if I would come to Owen's birthday party in April. I said yes. I did go to Owen's birthday party. It was at a park near their house. Owen ran across the grass to meet me when I pulled up, which is the kind of thing that settles certain questions permanently. Lily wanted to show me a new card game she learned. Suzanne and I were polite. Neither of us mentioned the previous 4 months. Brendan seemed relieved that the afternoon was normal. After the party, I drove back to Mooresville on the highway with the windows cracked, even though it was only in the mid-50s. I turned on the radio and found a station playing old country music, and I drove for 26 miles without thinking about very much at all, which was the closest thing to peace I had felt in a long time. My life in Mooresville is quiet. I do project reviews 2 or 3 days a week from a desk in the second bedroom. I have a routine: coffee on the back porch in the morning, regardless of weather, a walk around the neighborhood in the afternoon, dinner at 7. I joined a group of retired engineers who meet for lunch on the first and third Fridays of the month and argue about infrastructure and trade publications, which I find more enjoyable than I probably should. I see Owen and Lily every other weekend, either at my house or at a park somewhere between Mooresville and Charlotte. Owen is learning to fish properly now, not the one-time attempt at the lake outside Columbus, but actual fishing with patience and technique. He's better at it than he should be for his age. Lily beats me at every card game she knows and takes significant pleasure in this. I let her win sometimes. I also let her win the times I don't let her win, because she's genuinely good at cards. I have not spent a single night wondering whether I made the right call. There is a question people ask me when I tell this story, and I have told it a few times now, carefully and to people I trust. The question is, don't you think Brendan deserved a chance to respond? To choose differently? It's a fair question. I've thought about it seriously. Here's what I believe. Brendan is a decent man who loves his children, and I think loves me in the way that adult children love parents. Imperfectly, with blind spots, weighted by the daily pressures of his own life. He did not engineer the plan I overheard. The specifics, the facility on Park Road, the calculated cost, the timeline tied to the holidays, those came from Suzanne. What Brendan did was fail to push back on them. That's a different kind of failing, and it's one I can hold alongside everything else I know about him. I didn't give him a chance to choose differently because I wasn't sure he would choose differently, and I couldn't afford to be wrong about that. The Columbus house was sold. The 300,000 was intact, but I was 63 years old, and my options narrowed every year. I needed to be somewhere permanent and entirely mine before anyone could rearrange that for me. Agnes would have told me to trust him. I know that. She was the more generous one. Always. She believed in giving people the chance to rise to things. She also, in 34 years of marriage, never once let someone catch her flat-footed. She just did it with more grace than I do. I think about grace a lot these days. I'm not sure I handled all of this with the maximum amount of it, but I handled it with the maximum amount I had available at the time, which was an engineer's amount of grace, measured, functional, getting the job done. The house in Mooresville has a tulip poplar in the backyard. Enormous, probably 60 years old. In the spring, it blooms yellow and orange, and the whole yard smells like something I don't have a word for. Agnes would have had a word for it. She had words for everything. In the mornings, I carry my coffee out to the back porch, and I watch that tree. I watch the light come through the branches when the sun gets high enough. The dog, a beagle named Copperhead that I got from a shelter in March, a year after I moved in, sleeps in a patch of that light until it moves, then shifts himself 2 feet and sleeps again. I am 65 years old now. I have a house that belongs entirely to me, a dog that follows me from room to room, 2 grandchildren who beat me at cards and are learning to fish, and a memory of standing on a cold porch on the night of my birthday and understanding, finally and completely, that no one was going to build my future for me. I built things for 31 years, bridges and water lines and drainage systems that are still standing in 3 Ohio counties. I figured I could build one more thing. I did. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. Not to regret it, I don't, but to actually understand what it was underneath all the paperwork and the attorney meetings and the quiet months of preparation. What it was, at its core, was a choice. And the thing about choices is that they compound. They always do, in both directions. Suzanne made a series of choices, small ones at first. The way she started calling the suite the apartment. The way she began mentioning expenses in that sideways manner. The way she researched facilities and calculated costs, and set a timeline without ever once sitting down across from me and asking me how I was doing, what I wanted, what I needed. Each of those choices was, individually, maybe explainable. But stacked one on top of another over 3 years, they built something. They built a situation in which she was ready to hand a 63-year-old man a decision about the rest of his life without his input, without his knowledge, without his consent. I made choices too. I chose not to confront what I was sensing for longer than I should have. I chose to believe that warmth was still the dominant thing in that household, when the evidence had been quietly telling me otherwise for a year. Those choices cost me some time I can't get back, but then I made the choice to stop waiting for someone else to determine what came next for me, and that one I'll stand behind until the end. What I've come to believe is this. The consequences people face in life are rarely dramatic or sudden. They're almost always the accumulated weight of what they chose, day after day, when they thought no one was keeping count. Suzanne didn't lose anything in a single moment. She lost things across 3 years of small decisions that treated another person's dignity as an inconvenience, and what she ultimately lost was trust. Mine. And eventually, in ways I think she's still understanding. Brendan's too. Brendan called me 6 months after I moved to Mooresville. He said he wanted to talk, really talk, not the careful conversations we'd been having. We met at a diner between our 2 towns and sat for almost 2 hours. He told me he hadn't pushed back when he should have. I told him I understood that. I told him that what I needed from him going forward wasn't an apology so much as a direction. I needed to know which way we were headed. He said he wanted us to be close. I believed him. We're working on it. That's the part I want people to hear, maybe more than anything else. Intelligence without decency is just strategy. Strength without integrity is just force. What saved me in this situation wasn't that I was smarter than anyone or that I had resources. It was that I refused to let someone else's small character determine the shape of my life. I stayed methodical. I stayed honest with myself. I did not panic, and I did not retaliate. I just built something solid on ground that was entirely mine. My father used to say that a man who knows his own worth doesn't need to announce it. I spent 63 years not fully understanding what he meant. I understand it now. Owen and Lily were here last weekend. Owen caught his first real fish at the lake. Lily invented a new card game with rules she changes whenever she's losing. I grilled on the back porch, and Copper had supped under the table the whole time, and I thought about how strange and quiet and good it is to be exactly where you decided to be. That's what I built. That's what nobody could take.